All right. Well, welcome everyone to Ag Tech with Andrew. I'm your host, Andrew Bodden, and I'm joined with Sean Carr, President and CEO of MTE Biotech. So, Sean, just tell us a little bit about what your background is.
Hi, well, thank you for having me on the show. To make a very long and winding story a little bit more concise, my background is largely in microbiology and what we like to call synthetic biology, which is, it sounds a little bit crazier than it is, but the premise behind it is seeing how nature works as a system and then finding ways to harness that in a way that can kind of benefit humanity. My initial journey into biotechnology, I actually started my undergrad trying to do pre-med, so pre medical doctor route. But I learned really quickly that I didn't want to spend my entire career working with sick people, and particularly on the microbiology side, I didn't want to work with a bunch of organisms that actively wanted to kill me. But I did just become so fascinated with how microbiology works and how these systems of life that normally we would study a lot of them for trying to understand how diseases work, we can use those same tools to work with organisms that can benefit people. So I decided after getting my undergrad in microbiology to head over to the University of Nebraska Lincoln to pursue my PhD and specialized on studying exotic microbes, typically extremophiles and these organisms called archaea, which are just a really odd, eclectic bunch. But the thing that kind of unites them is they tend to push the limits of what life is sort of supposed to do, or at least conventionally what we think. So these are things that live in places. One of the big examples we like to use is acid lakes. These really rough environments, places where if you or I were to go swimming, we'd be dead in seconds. There are things that have decided to make this their home, and they don't just live, but they thrive there. And the lessons that we can learn from them kind of show us that we can harness these really unusual microbes that most people don't know exist, let alone that we can engineer them. We can use those to solve problems in areas, particularly in biotech, where innovation may be slowing down. So that's kind of the mission statement of MTE, is to go into those places where nature and life has come up with solutions for things that maybe humans have been spinning our wheels a little bit, and then trying to bring those into, well, out of academia and into, for lack of a better term, the real world.
I guess that takes us to MTE. Tell us about the company, how it got started, and kind of what your vision or your mission is with MTE.
Yeah, so the initial idea for MTE started while I was still finishing up my PhD, and something early on in grad school. I disappointed a bunch of my professors by saying, hey, I love everything that I'm learning here, but I don't really have an interest in academia. I don't want to be a professor. I'm glad that you're doing this work, but it doesn't really fit for me. What I did love, though, is every one of the projects that we would be working on, we started seeing these have potential not just for understanding for the sake of science, but we can bring this out and actually fairly easily integrate it into existing biotechnology. So for the big example is one of the products that we're developing is an enzyme cocktail called extremase. It's derived from some of those microbes that live in those really rough environments. And the sort of secret sauce of it all is because it's coming from organisms that live in really hot environments, really acidic environments, it's incredibly durable. And the only problem with that is in nature, you would have to grow these organisms in really rough environments. The big one for us is some of these things live at near boiling temperatures, and in a conventional laboratory sense, trying to have a bunch of, growth flasks going at 90 Celsius all the time gets a little tricky.
So these organisms, just like when they're not in this hostile world,
Hmm.
can they still survive?
Not very well. That's one of the tricky parts of looking at things from the nature side, where these bugs can live really rough environments. But if you tried to put them in your bathtub, they would die instantly. So what we really focused on doing was taking some of those genes, some of those enzymes that make these microbes work, and then using more conventional organisms to be able to produce it effectively without needing to have an acid lake in my backyard. So now we can use traditional fermentation, really not far from what you might think of for traditional ethanol production or even beverage making, and using that setup, but instead of making kombucha, we were making these highly effective enzymes. And that's in a nutshell really what MTE is aiming to do, which is take great technology and really exciting biochemistry and then make it accessible and bring it to the people who can actually use it, without having to change everything or completely redesign your workflow. So a lot of finding where has nature solved problems and then bringing those solutions to people who might not have known, hey, nature has already worked out with millions of years of evolution a better way of doing things.
So we're working in a microbial slash bio
Yep,
world. How does this transform itself into a commercial business? Like, where do we go? How do we go from taking this fantastic research to understand
yep,
all the stuff that, in our world, we don't even see because we
yep.
couldn't survive in it, and turn it into something that's commercial?
So for us, it's kind of twofold. You have the production of the technology, and that's something that is usually the early phase, which is we're making it ourselves and going out there, putting it in consumers' hands and saying, hey, try this out, see how it works with your system. And that's a lot more of the production side, which early on requires a lot more hands on our end because as anyone who's started up a small business can tell you, the beginning of things is you're wearing a lot of hats. There's a lot of time where I'm simultaneously doing the roles of head scientist, also janitor, also accountant, everything under the sun. But then and what we're currently at this kind of inflection phase is once we know that that technology is working and we can produce it at our scale, there's then the path of how much do we want to make it ourselves and how much can we make it more of a the technology is the product rather than the product being the product. So something that we are aiming to do down the road is work with potential partners and make it where, for instance, biorefineries, one of the examples that's often used is fuel ethanol. They have the facilities not just to make the ethanol, but they can also likely grow some of our engineered organisms. So it would be more of a almost like a subscription service where we would work with these groups and say, hey, you can buy our enzymes bulk from us. You can buy however much you need for running your biorefinery, or we can work with you where you license the technology and we work with you to develop things on site so you can directly use these enzyme cocktails, which isn't often the path that these things go. But we really believe that one of the futures of biotechnology is almost decentralized, and the idea of trying to put the tech into people's hands so you can save on things like transportation or shipping and storage.
Yeah.
Yeah. And these are things that we are still working towards, but is something that I really think could be greatly impactful for a lot of industries, being able to work more hand in hand with your enzyme providers or even with the technology being developed. So excited about that.
Yeah, for sure. So you talked a little bit about biofuels, in that kind of that processing system that
Mhm.
exists right now. How does your technology or your production then
Mhm.
integrate, and what is the benefit for the production side of things and for the grower?
Yeah. So when you're looking at biorefining in general, it kind of boils down to you're taking a plant product and you're trying to either transform it or extract something from it. Most of the time, you're trying to get sugar or oil out of there. And for a lot of plants, you can get a really good amount of that via just mechanical extraction. So grinding things, adding in water, separating stuff out. But something that makes plants is that they have a architecture to them. Everything that is making that tree grow and be strong, or that stalk be able to support itself against the wind, that stuff is much more difficult to break down completely, which means at the end of most biorefining processes, you're left with a lot of material that is either sold for low value, things like animal feed, or is just considered a, waste product that you're not going to be able to get everything from it. But that leftover material, your fiber, your cellulose, your lignocellulose, wood pulp, all of that still has more sugar and more materials trapped in there that's just not as simple to fully process if you're using more conventional means. So where our technology comes in, our enzyme cocktail is better at extracting more of that sugar, breaking down that matrix of the plant. So even though you would be using the same amount of crops, you are able to squeeze more of what you want out of that crop with less unused or undervalued product at the end. And there's a fun bit of synergy in there too, whereby we like to use the term deconvoluting, but just unraveling or unknitting this plant, it also lets the other ways that we would be getting things, so your more conventional ag processing, do its job better. So it allows all of the other tech to get where it needs to be more efficiently.
So when you, I mean, you talked a little bit about the efficiencies that this
Mhm.
does. Without getting too scientific, can you tell us a little bit about what it's doing?
Yeah.
And then there's got to be obviously a huge benefit because you're getting more out of the same product. So what kind of, sorry, just going to go back to agriculture, yield, volume, whatever
Yeah.
you're going to get more from doing this? Because obviously we're in a finite world and we've got less farmland than more farmland. So if we can get more out of it, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. So to really not get too much into the weeds of this, but there is in chemistry, the hotter things are, the quicker things happen. So when things are warmer, you've got more energy in a system and it allows you to do more. But it has a cliff where eventually things get too hot and then what's supposed to work doesn't anymore. Because our technology is derived from really, really hot environments, it allows us to run these conversions at much hotter temperatures in much quicker reactions because our enzymes can survive that really tough environment. And what that means from a ag user side of things is you can get more out of it quicker as well. So one of the things that is frankly expensive in a lot of biotechnology and bioprocessing is time. You often need to really heat things up, really cool things down, add acid or base, neutralize it. And each one of those steps, time, effort, energy. And that's where some of the complaints come in for some biotechnology is, well, you're spending money, we're spending energy to make energy. And using really extreme enzymes reduces the amount of input energy you need to get your final products. So when we're saying efficiency, we're not just talking about this one chemical reaction, we're talking about the whole pipeline in there.
Sure.
And something that I really believe strongly in is we do need to be using more renewables, but you need to be doing it smart. A lot of these biofuels are running on very narrow margins, and any advantage is something that can either shore up the business itself so it is more secure, but it also shows that everyone right now is, for the most part, using petroleum for most transportation. Early gasoline was not nearly the same level of efficient that we have now. And we're in a phase of that with biofuels as well, where now we are actually starting to hone in on better ways of making different types of fuels. And if we want to keep that momentum going, we have to make sure that it's not just, good for the planet, but also fiscally responsible. Because at the end of the day, the greatest tech in the world, people aren't going to be buying it if they can't afford to then, feed themselves.
Yeah. Hard to get investors into something that's not
Yes.
going to be
Yep.
commercially viable.
So for us, it's about finding those areas that maybe have been optimized to a point where you're getting less and less big steps, and then saying, how can we make something radically different than what's currently being used? And to use a little bit of a science example here, a lot of times in microbiology, people will use the same microbe for everything as much as possible just because it's what they know and is what's comfortable. It's the reason why basically everyone uses E. coli in their labs. Is E. coli the best microbe? No, but we sure know how to work with it. In biofuels, you get something similar where everyone is using the same technology that has been getting these tiny, tiny incremental improvements. But when you're polishing something, you're never going to fundamentally change it. You're just going to have a shinier stone. What we want to do is say, well, what if we look outside of that traditional approach? Why don't we look at the unusual stuff, the weirdos, the things that are sometimes really tough to study because they're so different than what we think the rules should be? And then that's suddenly a whole different ballgame where it is no longer getting your tiny, tiny improvements. It's utilizing something that is simultaneously radically different, but is designed in a way that's meant to fit with what you're already doing.
Yeah. It's absolutely makes sense to me. Can you just kind of fill us in a little bit about what bio waste or bioproducts
Mhm.
you've done this application for, and kind of what kind of results or feedback that you can share with us to date?
Yeah. So something that we've really tried to make a early priority is not being locked into just one feedstock. Something that can be tricky in a lot of biorefining is not all plants are created equal. They all have their own challenges in how you're going to work with them. But we wanted to try and make this as feedstock agnostic as possible. And that can be really helpful when you do run things hot and acidic, because that is kind of nature's existing way of breaking things down quickly. So early on when we were developing this technology, first priority was looking at corn just because it is pretty much universally one of the most used biotech feedstocks. And we were trying to see, can we get essentially more sugar out of it? And we saw, yes, we could. But then we started wondering, well, what else can we use? So we decided to try a lot of different plants, things like switchgrasses, wood pulps. Something that I was particularly happy we were able to use was almond shells in husks. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those, but whenever you are thinking about the almonds that we all enjoy, the actual plant is like the size of a baseball. And a lot of that is mostly waste. It's often just used as mulch afterwards. So we got ourselves a bunch of almond shells and husks, and then tested, hey, can we turn this into sugar? And we were able to extract sugar and oil from it, and then to make sure that it wasn't just making sugar for the sake of it, we were also able to ferment that and essentially made laboratory almond beer. Nobody drank it, but the proof of concept was we could convert this into ethanol. And that was kind of a switching point for us where we said, oh, wow, we don't need to be as locked in. You can obviously tailor it a little bit further, but if you're trying to turn plant bits into something useful, our tech, something we're excited about is, yeah, it really doesn't care what it's munching and turning into sugar. It just will seem to work under those conditions.
So you talked about some of the successes. Were there any ones
Mhm.
where you thought this was going to be a good opportunity, but just couldn't find that kind of that sweet spot to
Yeah,
pull that and
we've had a handful of things. I mean, science in general is one of those weird fields where it's sort of like baseball in the fact that if you say you're batting 300, people are like, dang, that's really good. You have success a third of the time. And that sounds outside of the realm of science as, wow, that means you're failing 2/3 of the time. No, it means we're learning 2/3 of the time, and then that extra third is moving on forward. For us, in addition to the wins, there was a lot of trying to make sure what we were doing was relevant and scalable. So it's not quite as easy as taking the gene from one organism and then putting it into a workhorse organism and seeing if it can work that way. We had to do a lot of iterations of tailoring it, making sure that we could not just grow them, but be able to harvest them properly, be able to harvest them at scale. And with all of those, it takes iterations. And something that we always are trying to do in the microbiology side is you design it as best you think you can and as intelligently as you think you can pull it off, but you can't ever know everything until you actually do the dang thing. So there will be times when you think you've designed it all perfect, and then it turns out one little detail that you didn't know you were supposed to look out for is now out of whack, and you've made a bug that just doesn't grow properly, or it makes your product but it folds weird. So we've had a handful of those, and that's also why I'm incredibly grateful for both my co-founders and the support, not just for our small business, but from the Lincoln community. So here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we've got the university there, but we also have these kind of independent areas. For example, I'm on a place called Innovation Campus, which is technically the university, but it's for independent businesses to operate. So we get that kind of best of all worlds. And the result of that is, we can operate, do our testing, do our scale up. But then if you get thrown a curveball and you need some support, we have those university resources, experts, and community that you can kind of lean back on. And as a result, it creates this really community vibe where everyone wants to succeed. And it's just great.
so I guess before we say goodbye, a couple of things. That one, you did talk about your partners, so maybe you want to give them a little bit of credit for this development to where you are
Absolutely.
today. And then my other two questions would be, what is next for MTE as it relates to the agricultural worlds? And then is there a other message that you might say to potential investors?
Yeah, well, definitely want to give a huge shout out to Dr. Nicole Buon and Dr. Paul Blum, my co founders. They were both on my committee and my advisors for PhD work, so I've spent quite a bit of time with them. And frankly, this wouldn't be possible without that collaboration side of it. So, huge thanks to them and their ongoing support with the company. Just lost my train of thought a little bit there as well.
Where does MTE go?
Where MTE is planning to go next, right now we're looking a lot in biofuels, but we are very interested in looking at some of the other areas of biorefining, particularly with interest in animal feed and textiles, which are two industries that, just like I said earlier with all biorefining, is it's trying to take something plant related and then convert it into something else using some of these high temperature enzymes and high efficiency enzymes that break down the plants more efficiently. Both makes it easier for you to get at the fibers and materials that you would want to separate in the textiles world. But then in the animal feed side of things, it's also making the plants more what we call bioavailable, which is essentially meaning the food is easier for the gut to convert into energy, and it's easier for those microbes already living in animal guts to turn that into the sugar and rumen that they would need for happier, healthier animals. And As far as looking at things from the investment side of things, we're at a really exciting phase, which is it's a new one for me. So it's that mixture of exciting and terrifying at the same time, where we've sort of reached the end of what we can start or do testing on bench scale. So we've kind of crossed our T's, dotted our I's, and shown that the technology works. Now the question is, how can we scale intelligently? And how can we get it into more people's hands in a way that fulfills that mission statement that we're looking for? So, looking for investors and partners that can help us go from a small scale proof of pre pilot to actually getting over that bridge of full production and series of customers that we can supply consistently.
Can you tell us just a little bit about what the production volumes have been through your
Yeah.
testing?
So early on, when we were doing proof of concepts, we have a bank of bioreactors that are growing things at 3 to 10 liters in scale. And then we have recently upped that to closer to 30 gallons per scale, or per run. And now we are trying to increase that further and create a sort of stepwise production where in microbio, I know I promised I wouldn't get too much into the weeds of things, but it's not always just having a big container. It's always jumping up that 1 to 10, 1 to 100 scale. So now that we're doing things at that 30-gallon scale, it's likely going to be jumping up to 300 and then 3,000 at a time.
Wow. So that creates a lot more
Oh, it's a big
product.
difference.
It's a huge difference. Yeah, yeah.
For us, one of the fun
Um,
parts of testing was going from doing things at a couple gallon scale to suddenly working with some of these plants that are 500,000 gallons in a fermenter, and they're 10 stories tall, all as one big fermenter. And man, oh man, that's a big jump.
yeah, for sure, for sure. I was going to ask you about that. Is it, when you went from that scaling from that small amount to that 30-gallon size, what I mean, what was that process like, and how more complicated was it?
So the testing itself wasn't as bad. It was mostly just doing things that we would be doing on the small scale, but just monitoring it at a much larger. The part that was tricky was having to produce the amount of enzymes that we would need for that big run. At bench scale, we're using milliliters at a time. And then when you're doing one of these large runs, it's gallons upon gallons. So there's this little bit nerve wracking steps where you're putting a lot of time and resources into every one of these tests. And it will sometimes take weeks or months to get enough material for one swing at that. And that's why we are now at the phase of increasing how much we can produce so it doesn't have that window so long in between. But it's also allowing us to work out the kinks and make sure that we're being smart about how we grow. So trying to not just jump into the deep end, but seeing, okay, here's how we can get that 10 times production, and then learn from that, dial it in a little bit more, then use it for the next step as well.
Yeah. That's, I mean, scale is always the biggest thing. It's
Yes,
easy
sir.
to do something in your bathtub, but when you get
Yep.
to to large scale, it changes everything, and that consistency becomes very important as well.
Yep.
So, sorry, I keep on throwing more questions your way, but these enzymes, obviously, they have to be in a state where they can
Mhm.
survive. What happens to them once they go through this process? Do they automatically, because the system cools and they just don't survive anymore? Or is there a way to extract them while they're still active?
Mhm.
I guess that's,
One of the
yeah.
things that is really exciting for us about these high temp enzymes is They have a broader range of specificity, so you can use them under a wide array of conditions, but they really work best when it is very hot. And something that's quite neat about them, though, is they can actually survive distillation. So, for a lot of places that recycle water and try and reuse as much material as possible, we can use these enzymes more than once. Normally, when things get really hot, they denature, fall apart, and then you've just got a dead enzyme cocktail. Ours, we've boiled them multiple times. For one of our runs was, I think, keeping it actively boiling for 30 minutes, and then they were still working afterwards. So you can get a lot more bang for your buck from this. And I think that's also going to be one of those key components moving forward in biotech is, we recycle a lot of materials in a lot of things like metals and cardboards. Reusability on a biological standpoint is something that isn't as utilized, and I think is going to be an important moving forward aspect to anything in tech is trying to get it, you can use it more than once or it will keep working after that initial dose. And then from a safety and environmental side of things, still having a kind of baked in fuse, as it were, where it will degrade over time. It doesn't work very well when it's cold, so you don't have to worry about causing imbalances down the road.
Yeah, that's I guess the other environmental risk that we have for sure. All right, so I'm not going to take much more time. I'd want to thank you again, Sean, for your time. And any last words you'd like to say to our audience?
Well, I appreciate you having me on here and really enjoyed the conversation. If anyone wants to learn a little bit more about our company and some of the tech that we're working on, you can always reach us at mtebiotech.com. And I am always happy to talk about both our tech or science in general. So I'm really happy that we've had this conversation here today.
All right. Well, thank you very much again, Sean. And on behalf of myself, Andrew Bodden from Farms.com, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.